I was checking the drainage in the basement when I found the black box tucked behind the insulation. It was a Tuesday evening, and the house was silent except for the low hum of the furnace. I reached in, expecting a leak, but my fingers closed around a heavy, moisture-proof container. I opened it and found a thick spiral notebook filled with dates and locations and names. I knew exactly what it was. This was the record of my marriage, written by a woman I thought I knew, but had never actually met. Only one person could have compiled this list. It was the moment I realized that every memory I had of the last 6 years was a carefully constructed lie. I did not feel my heart race. I felt a coldness settle into my bones that has not left me since. I sat on the concrete floor and turned the pages. 27 names. 27 men who had occupied the space I thought belonged only to me. The entries were clinical. Dates, times, amounts of money spent, and specific notes on their preferences. It was a business ledger. My wife was not just cheating, she was operating a shadow life that required the kind of organization I used to run my private equity firm. I looked at the entry for August 14th of last year. That was the day our daughter was born. There was a name listed for that afternoon. While I was holding her hand in the delivery room, she was texting a man named Silas to confirm a meeting for the following week. The realization of the scale of the betrayal changed my DNA. I was no longer a husband. I was a strategist dealing with a hostile takeover of my own life. I did not go upstairs to confront her. I did not scream or throw the notebook. Instead, I took out my phone and photographed every single page with high-resolution precision. I put the notebook back exactly where I found it. I adjusted the insulation. I wiped my prints from the box. I needed her to believe she was still safe in her secrets, because safety breeds carelessness, and I needed her to be very careless. I spent the next 3 months becoming a ghost in my own home. I watched her with the detached curiosity of a lab technician. I noticed the way her hand shook when she thought I wasn't looking. I noticed the tiny glassine baggies hidden in the lining of her designer handbags. The drug use was the secondary infection. She was using meth and fentanyl to numb the reality of the chaos she was creating. She had overdosed twice in the past year, and both times she told me it was a bad reaction to prescription medication. I had believed her because I wanted to be a savior. Now I realized I was just the primary investor in her self-destruction. I began the process of accumulation. Revenge is not an emotion, it is a sequence of events designed to restore control. I hired a specialized private investigation firm that didn't just follow people, but monitored digital footprints and financial transactions. We found the accounts. She had been skimming money from our joint savings for years to fund her habits and her lovers. She had even taken out a secret line of credit using my forged signature. Every dollar she spent was a brick in the wall I was building around her. I let her continue. I even increased the limit on the credit card she thought I didn't know about. I wanted the debt to be institutional. I wanted it to be a weight that no lawyer could ever lift from her shoulders. The plan required a specific kind of environment. I needed her to feel like she was winning. I started talking about our future in a new house and a fresh start. I watched her fake tears of gratitude while she was probably planning her next meeting in a motel. It was a performance of mutual deception. I was the director, and she was the lead actress who didn't realize the script had been changed. The debt was growing. The evidence was mounting. We had high-definition footage of her transactions and witness statements from the men in the ledger who were more than happy to talk when presented with a non-disclosure agreement and a small fee. Then came the arrest. It wasn't my doing, but it was the perfect catalyst. She was caught shoplifting at a high-end boutique while carrying significant amounts of fentanyl. It was a clumsy mistake, born from the arrogance of a woman who thought she was untouchable. She called me from the precinct, crying and begging for bail. I told her I was in meetings and couldn't get away. I let her sit in that cell for 3 days. I wanted her to feel the cold of the state. I wanted her to understand that the world outside was no longer under her control. When I finally bailed her out, I did it with a condition. I told her we needed to get away and clear our heads. I suggested a trip to Italy, specifically Milan. She thought it was a reward for her trauma. She thought I was the weak man who would always catch her. She didn't see the coldness in my eyes behind my sunglasses. I had already moved our daughter to my parents' house in the country. I told Bianca it was for the best, so we could focus on ourselves. She agreed because it meant she didn't have to be a mother for 10 days. We flew to Milan in first class. I watched her drink champagne and smile at the flight attendants, while I mentally reviewed the final documents my legal team was filing back in the States. Milan was gray and sharp. We checked into a suite that cost more than her secret debts. I spent the first 2 days in staged meetings, while she spent my money in the fashion district. On the third day, I told her I had a surprise. I led her down to the hotel garage, where a red Ferrari 296 GTB was waiting. It was the color of a warning light. It was a machine built for speed and precision. I told her it was ours for the week. She was ecstatic. She wanted to take photos. She wanted to show the world that she was still the queen of a life she had systematically betrayed. We drove out toward the lakes. The engine of the Ferrari was a symphony of power that drowned out the need for conversation. I pushed the car to its limits on the winding roads. I wanted her to feel the G-force. I wanted her to feel the danger. Every time I shifted gears, I thought about one of the names in the ledger. 1 for the first man, 2 for the second. By the time we reached the lookout point over Lake Como, I was in 7th gear, and the world was a blur of red and green. I pulled over at a secluded spot where the cliff dropped off into the dark water. I got out of the car and walked to the edge. She followed me, complaining about the wind in her hair. I didn't look at her. I looked at the horizon. I told her I found the notebook. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound of the Ferrari engine. I didn't turn around to see her face. I didn't need to. I knew the look of a person who has just realized the ground beneath them has disappeared. I told her that every transaction was documented, every dollar was tracked, every lover was interviewed. And I told her that while we were driving the red car through the Italian mountains, a process server was handing a comprehensive file to the district attorney back home regarding her drug distribution and financial fraud. I turned around then. She was white as a ghost, shaking. She tried to move toward me, to grab my arm, to start the crying routine. I stepped back. I held up my phone and showed her the live feed from our house. It was being emptied. All her belongings were in the driveway. The locks were being changed. I told her that the Ferrari was a rental in my name only, and that I was leaving for the airport in 10 minutes. I told her that her passports and her return ticket were in the glove box, but that I had already alerted the airline that she was a flight risk for a pending criminal investigation. I left her standing there, on the side of a mountain road, next to a red car she couldn't drive and a life she could no longer claim. The revenge was not in the abandonment. The revenge was in the fact that for the first time in 6 years, she was exactly what she had always been. A woman with nothing but a list of names that no longer cared if she existed. The descent into Chicago was a study in gray and white. I watched the frozen shoreline of Lake Michigan grow closer through the small window of the aircraft and felt a strange sense of alignment with the ice below. The warmth of the Italian sun was a memory I had intentionally left behind. In Milan, I had been a man testing the limits of a red Ferrari, but in Chicago, I was the architect of a structural collapse. I carried the digital copies of the ledger on an encrypted drive in my pocket. It was the only thing that felt heavy. The city was preparing for Christmas with a forced cheer that I found repulsive, but necessary for the optics of my plan. I was not coming home to a wife or a life. I was coming back to a crime scene that I was finally authorized to clean. I walked through O'Hare with a steady pace and ignored the festive music playing over the speakers. My car was waiting in the parking garage. I drove toward the West Loop, where my legal team had established a war room in a nondescript office building. I did not go to the house we had shared. That space was already being liquidated by a professional management company. I had no interest in seeing the rooms where the needles had been hidden, or the beds where the 27 names had been whispered. I was operating on a timeline that did not include nostalgia. The transition from a husband who felt empathy to a man who demanded justice was complete. I was no longer a sucker for her fake tears. I was the one holding the ledger. My lead attorney was a man named Arthur Sterling. He was a specialist in high-stakes dissolution and asset recovery. He didn't look at the situation with emotion. He looked at it as a series of liabilities to be neutralized. When I entered the office, he had the 27 names projected onto a screen. We had spent the last 72 hours cross-referencing those names with employment records and social media profiles. This was the beginning of the institutional pressure. I sat down and we began the process of sorting the list. These men were not just shadows, they were pillars of a support system she had built to insulate herself from the consequences of her actions. Many of them were married. Many of them held positions in companies where a scandal of this nature would be catastrophic. I was going to use their fear to isolate her. We spent the afternoon drafting the evidence packages. These were not emotional letters. They were cold sets of facts. Each package contained a time-stamped copy of the ledger entry and the corresponding evidence our private investigator had gathered. We sent them to the human resources departments of the companies where these men worked. We sent them to the wives of the men who had shared our home while I was at work. It was a systematic deconstruction of the world she thought she was hiding. I wanted her to realize that the secret life she had cultivated was now a public record. By the time I was finished, there would be no one left to answer her calls or provide her with the drugs she used to numb her reality. The financial audit was the next phase. Arthur had brought in a forensic accountant who had discovered a secondary layer of theft. It wasn't just the joint accounts she had drained. She had been using a series of offshore digital wallets to move money she had stolen from my business accounts over the last 4 years. The total was nearly $500,000. This moved the situation from a civil divorce into the realm of federal financial crimes. I authorized Arthur to turn all the findings over to the district attorney. I wanted the state to be the one to lower the hammer. I was just the witness providing the nails. The drug charges she was already facing in jail were just the beginning. I was adding money laundering and grand larceny to her record. I spent the night in a hotel overlooking the Chicago River. I sat by the window and watched the lights of the city flicker. I thought about the 3 overdoses. I thought about the times I had held her head over the toilet while she retched from the withdrawal. I had thought I was being a good man by staying. Now I realized I was just an enabler for a woman who didn't want to be saved. The bond that I thought was love was actually just a tether to her chaos. Every name in that ledger was a reminder that while I was fighting for her life, she was busy replacing mine. The empathy was gone. There was only the cold satisfaction of the strategy. The following morning, I met with the private investigator to review the footage from the house. He had installed cameras in the weeks before her arrest. I watched her bring strangers into our living room while our daughter was sleeping in the nursery. I watched her use a needle in the kitchen where we ate breakfast. The evidence was overwhelming. It was the final piece of the puzzle for the custody hearing. I didn't want her to have supervised visits. I wanted her to have no contact at all. She was a biological mother, but she was a functional threat to the safety of our child. I signed the affidavits with a hand that did not shake. I was erasing her from our future with the same precision I used to manage my firm. The social fallout was handled with a different kind of intensity. I sent a summary of the evidence to her parents. They had always blamed me for her instability. They had accused me of being too cold and too focused on work. They had claimed that my distance drove her to the drugs. I sent them the ledger. I sent them the photos of the needles and the names of the 27 men. I didn't include a note. I let the data speak for itself. The silence from their side was the most honest thing they had ever given me. There were no more excuses. There was no more gaslighting. The narrative she had constructed about our marriage was dead. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, the trap was fully set. She was sitting in a jail cell, waiting for me to bail her out so she could come home and cry for forgiveness. She didn't know that the house was sold. She didn't know that her clothes were in a storage unit in a city she couldn't reach. She didn't know that the people she had cheated with were currently losing their jobs and their marriages because of her ledger. She thought she was still the one in control of the game. I sat in the back of a black car and watched the snow fall as we drove toward the county jail. I wasn't going in to see her. I was going to watch the process server do his job. I wanted to see the moment the documents were handed to her. I wanted to see the realization hit her that the doors were not going to open. We pulled up to the gate, and I saw the server walk through the entrance with the thick envelope. Inside that envelope was the end of her life as she knew it. It contained the divorce papers and the notice of the criminal referral and the restraining order that prohibited her from coming within 1,000 feet of our daughter. It was a total institutional lockout. I waited in the car for 20 minutes. The snow was coming down in heavy sheets, and the world was silent. Then my phone buzzed. It was a video call from a contact inside the facility. I saw her in the orange jumpsuit, sitting at a table. I saw the server hand her the papers. She looked confused at first. Then she started to read. I watched her face transform from curiosity to horror. She looked around the room as if searching for an escape, but there were only bars and concrete. She started to cry, but this time the tears were real because they were for herself. She realized that the husband she had manipulated was gone, and in his place was a man who had used her own secrets to bury her. I told the driver to move. We drove away from the jail and back toward the city. I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the manic high of the red Ferrari in Milan. It was a deep and quiet stability. I had done the work. I had followed the protocol. I had turned my suffering into a strategy, and the strategy had worked. The 27 names were now just a footnote in a closed chapter. The Christmas lights in the windows of the stores didn't look so bright anymore, but the air felt easier to breathe. I went to the apartment where my daughter was staying with my parents. I walked into the room and saw her sleeping. She was safe. She was away from the needles and the strangers and the lies. I sat down on the edge of the bed and felt the weight of the last 6 years finally lift from my shoulders. I was not a victim. I was not a sucker for my empathy. I was a man who had reclaimed his life through the cold application of the truth. The story was not about the cheating. It was about the recovery of control. As the clock struck midnight and Christmas Day began, I thought about the ledger one last time. I thought about the names, Silas and Derek and the others. They were just ghosts now. My wife was a prisoner of her own choices, and I was a free man. I had served her the papers in the one place she couldn't run from. I had made sure that the world knew who she was. The revenge was complete because it was institutional. It was a permanent record that no amount of tears could ever erase. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 6 years, I slept without dreaming of what was hidden behind the door.
The first week of January in Chicago is a test of endurance. The wind off the lake cuts through the canyons of the Loop with a surgical precision that matches my internal state. I stood in the lobby of the Daily Center, watching the crowds of people rushing to escape the cold. They were worried about the weather and their commutes and their New Year resolutions. I was worried about the finality of the record. Today was the hearing for the permanent custody of my daughter and the finalization of the asset division. It was the day the 27 names would be entered into the public record as the primary evidence of a lifestyle that was incompatible with the safety of a child. I adjusted the knot of my tie and felt the weight of the gold watch on my wrist. I was a man of appointments and consequences now. The courtroom was a sterile environment of dark wood and fluorescent light. It was the kind of place where the messiness of human life is reduced to a series of exhibits and testimonies. My legal team sat to my left. They were calm and focused. Across from us was a table that remained empty for the first 10 minutes. Bianca was being transported from the county jail, and the delay was a small but satisfying reminder of her new reality. She was no longer a woman who could make people wait by standing in front of a door. She was a ward of the state. She arrived in a tan jumpsuit, her hands cuffed to a chain around her waist. The sight of her in that fluorescent light was a stark contrast to the woman who had sipped champagne in the first-class cabin to Milan. There were no designer bags and no fake tears that could hide the gray pallor of her skin. She looked at me with a desperate intensity, but I kept my gaze fixed on the judge. The hearing began with the presentation of the institutional evidence. Arthur Sterling stood up and laid out the facts with the detached efficiency of a machine. He didn't talk about betrayal or heartbreak. He talked about the forensic accounting report that showed the theft of nearly $500,000. He talked about the private investigator report that documented the presence of 27 different men in our family home over a period of 6 years. Then he reached for the black ledger. He described it as a log of transactional infidelity and parental neglect. He read the dates, he read the locations, he read the notes she had written about the drugs she had consumed while our daughter was in the next room. The courtroom was silent. Even the court reporter seemed to pause for a heartbeat as the scale of the deception was laid bare. The judge was a woman who had seen everything, but even she seemed struck by the clinical nature of the documentation. She turned to the defense attorney, a public defender who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. He tried to argue that the drug use was a disease and that the cheating was a symptom of a mental health crisis. He tried to play the empathy card that I had been a sucker for 6 years, but the institutional logic was too strong. Arthur countered with the police records of the 3 overdoses and the witness statements from the men on the list who had confirmed that Bianca was not a victim, but a willing participant in a shadow economy of sex and narcotics. The support system she had relied on was gone. The men had all signed affidavits to protect their own reputations and their own families. They had sacrificed her to save themselves, and it was exactly what she deserved. I was called to the stand to provide the final testimony. I spoke in a voice that was low and steady. I didn't mention the red Ferrari or the trip to Milan. I focused on the facts of the home. I described finding the needles in the nursery. I described the way she would look me in the eye and lie about where the money had gone while I was working 16-hour days to provide for us. I told the judge about the 27 names and the way the ledger had been hidden behind the insulation in the basement. I wasn't asking for pity. I was asking for the legal recognition of the truth. When I looked at Bianca from the witness stand, I didn't see the woman I had loved. I saw a stranger who had used my life as a laboratory for her own destruction. The bond was not just dissolved, it was completely erased. The judge didn't need long to deliberate. The evidence was overwhelming, and the institutional referral from the district attorney regarding the financial fraud made the outcome inevitable. She granted me full and permanent custody of our daughter, with no provision for visitation until Bianca completed a multi-year court-mandated rehabilitation program and served her sentence for the grand larceny and drug possession. The asset division was equally lopsided. Because of the documented theft of business funds, the court awarded me the entirety of our remaining domestic assets as restitution. Bianca was left with nothing but her debts and her record. As the bailiffs led her out of the room, she finally broke. She started to scream my name. She begged me to look at her. She claimed that she did it all because she was lost and that I was the only one who could save her. It was the same script she had used 1,000 times before. But this time, the doors to the courtroom were heavy, and the sound of her voice was cut off as they swung shut. I stood up and shook Arthur's hand. I felt a sense of closure that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with the restoration of order. I had used the system to do what I could not do with my own emotions. I had turned my suffering into a weapon, and I had won. I walked out of the Daily Center and into the cold afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, reflecting off the glass of the skyscrapers. I felt a strange sense of lightness. I had spent 6 years carrying the weight of a ghost, and now the ghost was behind bars. I went to the garage and got into my car. It wasn't the red Ferrari, but it was mine. I drove through the city toward the new apartment where my daughter was waiting.
I thought about the names in the ledger one last time. They were no longer threats. They were just data points in a solved equation. The final act of the revenge was the quietest. I returned to the storage unit where her remaining personal belongings had been kept. I had no interest in keeping them. I had arranged for a local charity that worked with recovering addicts to pick them up. I watched as they loaded the boxes of designer clothes and jewelry into a plain white van. These were the things she had used to build her false identity, and now they would be used to help people who actually wanted to change. I kept only one thing, the black ledger. I drove to the lake shore and walked out onto the pier. The wind was howling, and the water was a churning mass of gray. I took a lighter from my pocket and set fire to the first page. I watched the names, Silas and Derek, and the others turn into ash and disappear into the wind. I fed the rest of the book to the flames until there was nothing left but a charred spine. I threw it into the lake and watched it sink. The recovery of my life was not a journey, it was a destination. I had reached it through the cold application of consequences. I was a father, and I was a man of means, and I was finally alone in my own head. The story of the 27 names was over. I went home and made dinner for my daughter. We sat at the table and talked about the future. We talked about a world where there were no secrets behind the insulation and no strangers in the house. As I put her to bed, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the jail cell or the lost assets. It was the fact that I was going to be happy, and she was never going to be part of that happiness again. The red Ferrari was a memory of speed, but the silence of my home was the sound of victory.